Hey folks, welcome to week 8, I believe. Pretty crazy. Moving right along. I want to just do a quick orientation of this week. I would say it is the crux of what we do as special educators. Well, let me take that back. It's not necessarily the crux of what we do, but it's a very, very critical point that has very high stakes for what we do, which is provide specialized services depending on our roles. However, this is covering how students get into special education, and usually often that can be a good thing. Sometimes it maybe isn't so good and can have particular bias. So I want to share an anecdote before I jump into what we're going to be doing this week. So I was a special ed teacher in Ohio, and there are state set criteria for certain categories of special education, and actually for all of them. Some of them there's no real room for interpretation, but for some others there are. So for students with what we now commonly call intellectual disabilities, in Ohio at the time it was referred to, or a mild intellectual disability. Back then in Ohio it was referred to as developmentally handicapped. And a big part of how we identified students to fit into that particular category was based on the IQ score. And in Ohio, the cut score on the IQ test to fall into that category was 80, which was actually, I believe, the highest in the nation, or one of the highest cut scores. So in my opinion, there was often very little difference between students who were identified as DH, as it was referred to, and kids who were identified as having a learning disability. To be perfectly frank, the biggest and most distinct characteristics of the students in those two categories in the one school that I taught in was the color of their skin. Black kids were mostly identified as DH, and white kids were mostly identified as learning disabled. So reflect on that, actually, just that part of what might be the difference there. And one thing I often share, I share these things when I'm teaching face-to-face, and sometimes it's why it's a challenge to teach online without posting 20-minute videos every week. But this anecdote I find very interesting. So, I don't use the R word, even though it's still kind of a clinically accepted definition. I don't use it. I use the term intellectually disabled. But in the case where I taught in Ohio, so it was very close to Indiana, okay? So Indiana's cut score for identifying someone as having a mild intellectual disability was 75, okay? So 80 in Ohio, 75 in Indiana. So I often joke that kids could get in a car and be identified in special education as having an intellectual disability. Get in a car in Ohio, drive a half hour to the west into Indiana, and as soon as they cross the state lines, they would no longer be mildly mentally retarded. Okay? That's what we're talking about this week. Is identifying kids as having a disability. And oftentimes, I'm afraid the longer we're involved in all this, it's really easy for us to, it's just a process, right? And it's just part of our jobs. But the consequences are often huge. in the case of where I was teaching at that time, most of these kids were identified as having a developmental handicap by, and you didn't see my air quotes there, first, second grade, probably second grade, most of them, third grade, a lot of them. And it was amazing to me when I looked through their files that most of them had IQ scores of 80, right? So there seemed to be bias. And in fact, I had a senior supervisor there tell me that in the 70s and the 80s, it was basically the way it was done. It was white kids went here, black kids went here, which is just amazing that somebody would admit that. But that's 100% true story. I actually like this guy, but he was just speaking honestly with me, and it just kind of really blew my hair back. So in this school, the reason I'm so passionate about this is that, I really think it made big differences in these kids' lives that they were identified and put into these programs in second grade. I think it had major implications for the quality of education they received. In fact, I think they were totally written off when they were put into special education, and they, in my professional opinion, received horrible educational experiences, to the tune of not being able to spell their address as juniors in high school, sometimes struggling to spell their name, not being very good readers, definitely not, most of them not very good at comprehending, just a list of things they were absolutely capable of doing, but couldn't due to the inferior education they received. And I absolutely believe a part of that was because of the color of their skin, how they entered into special education and the services they received. I'm extremely passionate of this, and I think Montana has some similar issues with Native students who experience very similar things. So think about those things as you're moving into your careers. This is very important stuff, there's so much to talk about relative to this, and I'm trying to get at some of that within the discussion thread for this week. So I'm going to start going through what I have posted for this week. I'm pretty excited about this. It's a lot. There's a lot of stuff on the Moodle for this week, but I think it's doable. So the first thing you're going to see is the special education process, which is a PowerPoint that I developed. Actually, I didn't develop. It's from a publisher. I've been using this forever. It's actually old. I really try to update everything all the time. But this is old, and I use it because it's so succinct and right to the point. So, and there is a series of 8 steps, or a series of steps, and then a very succinct list of the components of an IEP. Those are things you should just know. You should be able to recite that. In fact, you're going to need to towards the end of the semester. You're just going to have to memorize these things because these are things you should know as you move into the field. Okay, so it's a nice, easy PowerPoint that really sums everything up about this process. Okay, now of course this is let me see here. Before you do the PowerPoint, and I actually don't have this on the Moodle, but please read Chapter 9, which obviously is going to give you a nice, more comprehensive overview, and then this PowerPoint is going to narrow it down for you. And then I have a folder with a series of forms from Montana. Okay. So these forms are forms that would be used within this overall identification and evaluation process, okay? And those are going to come up later. But I do want you to review those, spend some time with them. These are things that you're going to be using all the time in the field, okay? And then this is kind of fun. I hope you see it as fun, but also as meaningful. The next thing you're going to see is something called the Chitlin test. And I'm not going to tell you too much about it because I just want you to do this. Some of you may have already done this in another class, I don't know. But that's all I'm going to say about it, and then it comes up later within the discussion thread, okay? So the discussion thread that I want you to do in your groups, once again, let's keep a similar timeline of trying to post by Monday. This is a little bit longer probably, so it might take you a little longer, but communicate with your group mates. I don't get hung up, especially with this sort of thing. Sorry, I just saw a typo. Within the discussion threads, but you do need to be thoughtful of your classmates and your group mates. So communicate with one another, and if you need more time to do this, that's fine. Okay, so after you do read the chapter in the text, review the PowerPoint that I've shared, peruse all of the forms that I have posted, and then do the Chitlin test, and then engage in the discussion forum. So most of it is pretty straightforward. I'm asking you to share your score on the Chitlin test. If you really don't want to do that, I'm guessing most of you are going to do horrible on it, which is kind of the point. But if you really don't want to share it, I guess I probably shouldn't say you have to. So, but hopefully you'll just go along and have a fun experience with this, an insightful experience. And then this may seem silly, but using those forms that are in the folder and using the names of them, I want you to work as a group and put them in the order they would go. So I just want one response, I mean like literally a list of the order in which you would use those forms within this process. This is just a very practical activity to get you to really start to see how the process goes, all right? Now, one of those forms, and this is the fifth thing I'm asking you to do, are the criteria for the different categories within Montana, okay? So kids have to qualify under a specific category, right? Which is really unfortunate. I hate to even say that, a category of what? But that is the fact of the matter. And the best explanation in all the education I have in all of this is, why do we really need categories? Because there is a movement for non-categorical special education. The only explanation I've ever received is that we need to do that for funding. Well, that's sad, frankly. So I'm wanting you to look at the criteria. I want you to look at all the criteria, but I want you to look at emotional disturbance. And I have a bias towards that, and I can explain that another time. But I want you to see, compared to the other criteria, I think you're going to be intrigued by the criteria. I mean, you know, and this is what we use in Montana to determine if someone's going to receive special education services or not. So I want you to think about emotional disturbance and give a critique of that, okay? And that'll be done individually within the groups, okay? So real quick, I will be in the next few days reviewing your first hypothetical, and I will also be assigning a participation grade. It looks like all of you are doing fine with that, but I will give you kind of a midpoint participation grade also, so keep your eyes open for that. As I always say, please get in touch if you would like to chat, and if you want to meet, let's just set a time and get together and meet or talk on the phone. So thank you very much, folks, and I hope you have a great week.